Okay, good morning. I make that 11 o'clock by my watch, and welcome to this webinar, CIRIA's webinar on the integration of non-flood defence structures into the flood defence system, a review. My name is Andy Moores. I'm the Director of Research at CIRIA, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you the author team. But first, just a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of background about who CIRIA are and what we do. So this webinar is being recorded. Attendees are in listen-only mode, and so we do want your participation. As you can expect, we have a few pre-prepared questions for our panel in the plenary, but these things are always better if we get some audience participation. If you do have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box down at the bottom. If you've got any technological problems, just raise your hand, and Charlotte, who is running around in the background, will try to solve your problems. There is also a chat box, but if you've got anything to share, please put those in there, but we would prefer you to use the Q&A box. If you see any questions that you particularly like in terms of what other people have asked, just give that a thumbs up. It helps us in curating the questions and working out which are the most popular questions to put to our panel. If you are of a social media persuasion, you can share your views with the Twitter handle @CIRIA Updates and the hashtags non-flood defence structures and hashtag flood prevention. So a little bit about CIRIA. So CIRIA is the Construction Industry Research and Information Association, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially we are a not-for-profit member-based organisation. And we really operate at the interface between academic research and practice on the ground, producing guidance, training, webinars, knowledge sharing events, which help people, if you like, do the do on at the coalface. We aim to be the leading provider of knowledge, aimed at improving performance across the built environment and construction sectors. And as I say, we're wholly independent and are known for our authoritative guidance, as well as the training course provision. If you've got any questions about training provision, please have a look at our website or get in touch. We've been around for about 60 years. We celebrated our 60th anniversary, having been spun out of the Institution of Civil Engineers back in the 1960s. And we're very proud of our heritage and our independence. I mentioned that we're a membership organisation. Our members are drawn from a large cross-section of the industry. We count government departments, key public agencies like the Environment Agency, National Highways, Network Rail, amongst our key clientele. We're also very well represented amongst the Tier 1 contractors and consultants, through the wider supply chain, through the utilities companies, and also increasingly the university sector, where the need to produce impact from research is becoming particularly prevalent. Excuse me, put my teeth in. If you do have any inquiries about membership as well, we'd also love to hear from you. But you can see there that we've got a wide cross-section of the industry who are already intimately involved in CIRIA membership and what we do. This particular project, we are reliant on funding from our members and beyond, and this particular project was funded by two organisations, namely National Highways and the Environment Agency, so just an opportunity to thank them. Our work wouldn't happen without funding contributions at a project level. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the project steering group. This is a complex issue, as you're about to hear, and we tried to draw upon the expertise from a wide range of experts from a range of risk management authorities and beyond. So you'll see there that the EA is represented, Natural Resources Wales, Scottish Government, and a range of others. I'd particularly like to draw attention to Craig Berman from Schofield Sweeney, who provided legal input into the project, and also Graham Knott from ACOM, although he's now retired, who was heavily involved in the original scoping of this with the CIRIA team. I'd also like to point out that the advertised schedule did include a presentation from Jonathan Moxon from Leeds City Council. Unfortunately, he's not able to make it. He has a good excuse. He was going to present on the application of the designation process through the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme, but he's actually got a meeting for Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme Phase 2 today, so unfortunately he can't make it. So we're going to try and synthesize some of the learning in a general sense from what Jonathan would have said today, not specific to Leeds, but with the application of a designation within the urban context. So the way that it's going to work, we're going to run through a little bit of the background in terms of the context and the purpose for the work. We're also going to then look at the why, the methodology, the approach, and synthesize the key findings. We're then going to have an interactive discussion and Q&A. Just a reminder, please do type your questions as you go along into the Q&A box. That will help us to give the speakers some time to think about the best answers to those. And then we'll have a wrap up, and we hope to be done by about 12. We've got some flexibility on that, but we recognise that people's diaries are busy. Just want to say thank you to our speakers in advance. Philip Smith, who is also now retired, but formerly of Royal Haskellowing DHV, was our project steering group chair. And then the author team, which was from ACOM, comprising Fable, Becky Plummer and Flick Street, all of whom you'll hear from later. We will endeavour to put their potted CVs in the chat facility in terms of their backgrounds. But it just remains for me to now hand over to Philip Smith, who is going to take us through context. Philip.
Thank you, Andy. My name's Philip Smith. I was the chairman of the project support group for this project. And the project really originated out of dual parallel discussions that were being held within both the CIRIA Ground Advisory Panel and the EA-DEFRA Joint Flood and Coastal Risk Management Programme, which is FCRM. I'll keep coming back to that term FCRM, so please remember its context. And these discussions related to the performance of non-flood defence embankments in particular, but went on to look at non-flood defence structures in general that were subject to flooding. We know from climate change predictions that we are to expect a higher frequency of extreme weather events, and consequently an increasing number of non-flood defence structures which haven't hitherto experienced flood loading will be subject to that loading, and some will experience greater loads than have previously been applied. Some of these structures won't have been designed as flood defence structures or maintained to resist flooding. And as a result of this, the risk of the poor performance during extreme events is increased. As a result of these concerns that were raised by the two separate groups, 2 CIRIA workshops were held with interested parties to explore the concerns relating to the situation. And this led to the identification of quite an important issue. So whilst infrastructure elements can provide a flood risk management function, they haven't always been designed in such a way to perform well during this case. And also, they may not have been formally designated as FCRM assets. And that designation process, if they're owned by third parties, is quite an important feature. So the FCRM function of these structures may not be recognised in relation to maintenance, adaptation, or future development works, and the responsibilities and liabilities of the owners may not be clearly defined. And this then is potentially a dangerous situation which may lead to unanticipated or uncontrolled flooding, particularly as we know that flood defence systems work as a system, as a chain, and that they're only as strong as the weakest link in that chain. And we might have a fantastically designed, fantastically well-performing flood defence, which is completely undermined by a weak link somewhere along the line. This work that has been carried out by ACOM examines the process of designation, the legislation that underpins the process, and the application of the designation process in practice. It clarifies the responsibilities and liabilities of the asset owner and the designating authority, and makes recommendations for improving the designation process. It's important to note that it's not a formal review of policy, and it does not make policy recommendations. Similarly, the project was really seen as a starting point as for the improvement of the way in which third-party assets are owned and managed. The project has delivered a review of how the designation process is currently being applied, but it's not it's not a direct guide to designation. Any further work will have to be carried out in the future. So now I'd like to hand over to the project team, ACOM. The authors of the report were primarily Fable, Rebecca Plummer and Felicity Street. They will be giving this presentation. They will take you through the process of the consultation and the approach, the methodology and the findings of the report. And they will lead us through the next few slides. So I'm going to hand over to the project team, and I think Faye is going to take the lead at first.
It's great to see so many of you dialed in today, and really good to see the level of interest in this piece of research that Becky, Flick and I led on. As Philip has summarised, not all assets which perform a flood risk management function are classed as formal flood defences. There is a mosaic of structures and features across the urban and rural, inland and coastal landscape which are not flood defences, but which affect the flow of floodwater across the land, and therefore they perform an important flood risk management function and form an important part of flood risk management systems. These features can vary in scale, and they can range from small scale culverts or walls through to much larger scale features like buildings which abut riverbanks, raised features around our ports and harbours, or pumping stations to manage water levels for agricultural purposes. Throughout our research, we've called these features non-flood defence structures. That's a little bit of a mouthful, and they are sometimes known in our industry as de facto flood defences. But we're acknowledging the fact that the primary function of these assets is not flood risk management, but they do perform an important role. Now, in 2010, new legislation was introduced in the form of the Flood and Water Management Act, which, as many of you will know, changed the shape of the industry that we work in. And specifically in relation to non-flood defence structures, Schedule 1 sets out the ability for an authority to designate a non-flood defence structure. Now, this is a very wordy slide and you can read it at your leisure, but the crux of it is that designating a structure means that the structure cannot be altered, removed or replaced without the consent of the authority which designated it. Importantly and interestingly, designation doesn't impose any maintenance obligations on the owner of the structure or on the designating authority themselves, and it doesn't prescribe who will be responsible for the costs of future maintenance. Schedule 1 defines a designating authority as the Environment Agency in England, Natural Resources Wales in Wales, lead local flood authorities, district councils and internal drainage boards. Water companies and highway authorities do not have designation powers, even though they are defined as risk management authorities under the Flood and Water Management Act. To designate a feature, there are 4 conditions that need to be met, which are in the red box there on the screen. Condition 1 is that the designating authority considers the existence of a structure which performs a flood risk or coastal erosion risk management function. Condition 2 is that the designating authority has a function in respect to the risk that's been identified. Condition 3, that the structural feature is not designated by another authority. And condition 4 is that the owner of the structural feature is not a designating authority themselves. That basically means that, for example, a lead local flood authority would not be able to designate an Environment Agency asset. In addition to the legislation, there is guidance on the designation process, which has been issued by DEFRA and Natural Resources Wales. But despite the guidance and despite the legislation, evidence suggests that few assets have been designated in England and Wales. And why is that an issue? Well, as Philip mentioned earlier, there is a risk that the non-flood defence structures are not identified and they are not protected, and thereby it increases flood risk to people and property, and that problem will only become worse when the effects of climate change are taken into account. The aim of this study was therefore to investigate the use and implications of designation by achieving the objectives here on the screen. We needed to gather information on the use of legislation and better understand the approaches that have been taken to date, to understand the responsibilities and liabilities for asset owners and designating authorities, and to provide recommendations for improvements. I'm going to hand over to Becky now, who will talk us through the methodology that we used.
Great, thank you, Faye, for doing that kind of like brief introduction. So I'm just going to do a quick talk through the methodology and how we approached this piece of research. So just to reiterate, this research study pretty much set out to gain a greater understanding of the use and the implications of the designation process, with the aim of identifying any actions and resources required to overcome the potential challenges associated with designation. So the flowchart just shown on the screen now shows the general process that we followed throughout this study. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on these boxes as we go through the next few slides. So we began the research with the Project Steering Group kickoff meeting back in July 2021. So the Project Steering Group brought together people from a variety of different organisations and different roles within those organisations. So we had government agencies, local councils, consultancies, infrastructure organisations, and especially the kind of inception stage of this, the discussions were focused on highlighting what the current understanding of the guidance was, the current understanding of the specific legislation associated with it, and agreeing those kind of the parameters of the study and how we were going to approach the research. So the primary research method that we used to inform the study was questionnaires. So a questionnaire was disseminated to key stakeholders across the UK. This was all done online and looked to explore the details of designation experiences, the perceptions surrounding the designation process, in order to kind of build up a picture of how the guidance was being used, if it was actually being used at all. So those themes that we used for the questionnaire are kind of shown on the screen now. And they were all designed around trying to help us answer those research questions and those project objectives. So through these questions, we wanted to gauge any understanding and awareness of the process within the industry, any assets which had been designated or considered for designation, the perceived benefits and constraints of this process, and then looking at the kind of recommendations for change of how it could be improved and what would, I guess, make it more applicable and more user-friendly. So 2 questionnaires were launched online. One was tailored towards designating authorities, and the second was tailored towards asset owners. So the answers to the first couple of questions, which were regarding organisation and roles in organisation, determined an appropriate questionnaire to be linked to. So both of these questionnaires pretty much covered the same questions, but they just asked them from different perspectives. So, for example, where a designator would be asked, do you have experience of designating an asset, or are you aware of assets which would be suitable for designation? The asset owner was asked, are there any assets which your organisation owns or is responsible for, which could be designated, or are you aware of other assets that owned by your organisation that could be suitable? So the questionnaire was live for several weeks, and kind of following the closure of that, we were able to pull a load of statistics off and do some analysis on those first results. The overall response rate for the questionnaire was very good. We got around 90 questionnaires back from a range of authorities and asset owners. Kind of breakdown of that is shown on that pie chart on the screen. So the respondents represented a range of roles within these organisations as well. So we had from technical directors, engineers, policy leads, kind of asset managers and technical advisors. So we had a good range in that respect. We did have some key organisations where we didn't receive any respondent data back. So there was no data available from internal drainage boards or from national highways. And kind of as well as that, we do have some geographic variation in the coverage of the responses that we got back. So, for example, we don't have any information back from Northern Ireland, and kind of by contrast, as you can see in that pie chart, we had a significant number of Welsh respondents, predominantly from Natural Resources Wales. So there's quite a large block in that pie chart called unknown. So there were 27 respondents with the questionnaires that we got back, which were effectively excluded from the analysis just due to the fact that they weren't fully completed, and we didn't want that to skew the results. So they were included in this initial kind of breakdown, but excluded from any follow-on analysis after that. And I think the kind of crucial take-home point from the questionnaire analysis stage was that there aren't that many people with experience of designation, and a lot of the kind of respondents that we had seem to be referring to perceptions of the process rather than the actual legal process itself. So following that kind of high-level analysis of the questionnaire, we picked a couple of examples for follow-up case studies, which we undertook as interviews. So these were either based on feedback from the project steering group, who knew about examples, or from respondents who filled out the questionnaire and highlighted that they had experience and were happy to be contacted for further information. So given the limited number of examples that we have available, the case studies were chosen partially based on availability, but also they do each help to showcase a different element of the kind of designation in the process that we were looking to uncover. So there were 3 case studies included within the report. The first one is the flood alleviation scheme in Morpeth, which was a successful example of the designation process. It involved the retention of the existing flood defences and the addition of a couple of new flood defence assets. As part of this scheme, 2 of these assets were successfully designated. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that one because I appreciate my colleague Flick is going to cover that a little bit more just in a couple of minutes' time. The second case study we looked at was the Leeds flood alleviation scheme. So we undertook an interview with Jonathan Moxon from Leeds City Council, who are currently working together with the Environment Agency, leading on phase 1 of the Leeds flood alleviation scheme. The overall aim of this to improve the level of protection to homes and businesses in the Leeds downstream of Granary Wharf. This scheme was completed in October 2017. In this example, though, designation was considered but was never actually followed through. So it was considered in order to ensure the protection of the assets, but ultimately not used just due to the number of perceived limitations and challenges with the kind of legislation. So without going into too much detail on this in Jonathan's absence, but Faye is going to touch on some of these kind of challenges of complex urban environments in a few slides' time. The key challenges kind of highlighted by this case study were an unrealistic number of assets which would have been required to be designated, and also some conflict within the designation guidance itself. So that was, as Faye touched on earlier, a designating authority can't designate to another designating authority. And finally, the last case study that we looked at was the designation of relict offences in Lincolnshire. So Lincolnshire has many privately owned historic flood embankments which were constructed as frontline sea defences. Many of these have subsequently been replaced with newer flood defence structures, which are all now managed and maintained by the Environment Agency. So these older defences, which no longer perform primary flood defence, are known as relict defences. The Lincolnshire Flood Risk and Water Management Strategy Group provides strategic and policy direction to the Lincolnshire Flood Risk and Water Management Partnership. And then following a breach of these frontline sea defences in 2013, the strategy group considered whether it would be possible to designate some of these relict defences, which were still capable of forming that flood defence function. So designation was considered as a way of preventing erosion or removing these relict defences, and therefore preserving that flood mitigation value. Ultimately, this wasn't pursued, again, mostly due to some perceived limitations of the guidance. So firstly, it was determined that they were already effectively protected under other legislation. So under the environmental permitting regulations in 2016, would prevent the removal of these defences anyway, just due to their proximity of maintained defences. And secondly, the strategy group saw a benefit in preventing erosion to degradation of these defences. However, again, as we've touched on briefly, the designation of these kind of assets does not prescribe any maintenance regime or obligations on either the asset owner or the authority who designates it. So it doesn't really help solve that problem of who's maintaining these assets. So these case studies were a really good opportunity to expand on the questionnaire themes that we've gone through and the results that we've got back through that, and get a better understanding of how the process had actually been used or where it had been considered to be used, as well as being able to kind of include some real world limitations, constraints and benefits associated with the process, and what we can learn from that. So I'll pass on to Flick now, who's going to discuss some of the key findings from the research work.
Thanks, Becky. So yeah, I'm going to give you a summary of the key findings and the recommendations of our research. Perfect. So of the 90 responses that we did receive, only 19 respondents indicated that they have been involved within the designation process or are aware of when their organisation has designated an asset. So when you first have a look at this chart on screen, it does look like there's lots of experience and there's lots of assets which have been designated. But I think it's important to note here that of these 19 respondents, it's not clear whether multiple respondents had referred to the same asset which has been designated, or whether there are 19 separate examples of designated assets. So as you can see here, respondents have referenced a range of different types of assets which have been designated, with earth embankments and walls cited as the most common form of designated asset. So the example here on the right, as Becky mentioned previously, is one of the first examples of designation. So this involved the successful designation of 2 assets, which took place as part of the Environment Agency Flood Alleviation Scheme in Morpeth in 2015, which aimed to provide protection from the River Wansbeck. The scheme involved the retention of the existing 1960s defences, alongside the addition of new flood defences for the unprotected areas of the town. As the scheme was being developed, guidance about the application of designation was issued, which offered an opportunity to use the designation process following the completion of the scheme. During the development of the scheme, it was recognised that an old car garage wall within the area was also performing a flood defence function. So you can see in this top right image here, this car garage wall. At the time, the wall was in fairly poor condition and the site was bought for redevelopment as a retirement home. And the wall was subsequently rebuilt and designated as a flood defence asset. The second asset, just included here underneath, included the integration of a property that benefited from a tank basement within a new set of linear flood defences. The proposed flood walls therefore tie into either side of the property, rather than constructing an additional set of defences sort of near or next to the property. It was suggested that owners of both the car garage wall and the basement wanted to maintain ownership of their properties, and it was considered at the end result that both the asset owners and the designating authorities were happy with the outcome. So, as illustrated in the chart, 24 respondents suggested that they do have access to the resources required to undertake formal designation, and this includes utilising both internal and external resources. Conversely, 15 respondents suggested that they do not have the resources required to designate, suggesting that they don't have sufficient legal support, budget, and time required to adopt and monitor the designated assets. Several respondents also indicated that they are not aware of the resources required for designation. When respondents were asked what they perceive the responsibilities are, respondents listed obligations such as the obligation to obtain consent before carrying out the works to alter or remove the designated structure, and they also listed general maintenance requirements of the assets. However, as mentioned previously, it's important to note here that the legislation itself does not prescribe maintenance obligations on the asset owner or the designating authority. In general, an asset owner is liable to maintain the asset, but cannot be compelled to carry out works unless other legislation or common law requires them to do so. So this highlights that there is uncertainty regarding potential responsibilities and obligations associated with the designation process. So following a review of both the questionnaire and the interview responses, a number of benefits, risks, and constraints have emerged from the research. The most referenced benefit was that designation would prevent the removal of the asset or prevent a change in its future use that could hinder its performance as a flood defence function. The Morpeth flood alleviation case study, as discussed previously, also highlighted a number of benefits following designation. This included, for example, cost savings for the designating authority as they were able to utilise the property wall as part of the linear flood defence, reducing capital costs of constructing a new flood defence. It was also noted that the designation of both properties was very straightforward and took around 2 months from start to finish, with both the asset owner and the designating authority noting that they were happy to designate assets again in the future. Respondents also cited a broad range of key barriers or constraints associated with the pursuit of designation that could arise during various points of the process. These included barriers such as the lack of time or resources required to deliver additional duties such as the management and inspection of the asset, and the potential concern as to whether the designation process offers additional benefits over alternative forms of legislation such as permitting or consenting requirements. Whilst the number of cited risks and constraints was greater than the cited benefits, I think it's important to note that both the benefits and the constraints listed here are largely from respondents who may not have experience in the designation process. This is also highlighted by certain responses, such as the perception that designation would lead to clear accountability and responsibility for management, inspection and maintenance of the asset, which, as we discussed previously, maintenance responsibilities associated with the designation is an inaccurate perception. So this lack of understanding and clarity may help explain why the uptake of designation is relatively low. So with increasing flood risk due to climate change and other developmental pressures, non-flood defence structures may have an increasing role to play in fulfilling their flood defence function. Whilst there's been limited application of designation to date, the research indicates that there are still opportunities to designate assets in the future. As such, as part of this research, we have identified 4 recommendations for improving the process and uptake of designation. So given the number of barriers and constraints listed by respondents, an improved support network may help those looking to designate overcome the perceived or actual barriers associated with the process. This may include, for example, creating a network of individuals or organisations with experience of designation who could help provide advice and support to those looking to designate. The research highlighted that most respondents were not aware of alternative legislation, so it might be useful to provide additional guidance, using some of the lessons learned from the last 10 years, to raise awareness of what alternatives are available for those where designating is not considered the most suitable option. As mentioned previously, the research highlights the uncertainty in and the conflicting perceptions regarding maintenance responsibilities associated with designation. As the current guidance does not deal with maintenance obligations, it's recommended that future guidance considers how to ensure designated assets are sufficiently managed and maintained. Given the uncertainty over the designation process, it might be useful to create a register to help monitor, update, and provide a coherent record of designated assets, which can help provide examples for those looking to designate assets in the future. We hope that these recommendations will lead to a better understanding of flood risk and performance of structures during flood events. So this concludes our key findings sections. I'd like to pass over now to Faye, who's going to give an overview of the complexities of designation in an urban setting.
Thanks, Flick. Just checking you can hear me after the issues earlier. Give me yeah, good. Thank you. If you could just flick onto the next slide, that'd be wonderful. So obviously, Jonathan Moxon was advertised to be presenting about the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme, which, as we've already mentioned earlier, the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme investigated the use of designation, but didn't pursue it because they found that there were many assets that would need to be designated, and that other legislation was available to them which would offer them the same or better outcomes, particularly in terms of maintenance. So in Jonathan's absence, and just before we move into the Q&A session, I wanted to take a little bit of time just to reinforce the complexities in our urban settings in particular. And we've pulled out some key themes in the circles there on the slide. Now, it's important to note that these aren't in direct relation to Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme. These are common themes that we had throughout the research that we found from respondents to the questionnaire and from interviews that we undertook. But the photographs at the bottom there are of the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme and do demonstrate some of these points quite nicely. There is a heavy reliance in urban settings on third-party assets for a continuous defence line. Now, the bottom left-hand photograph there is of Air Bar, and you can see where we have a building which goes straight into the River Air there and basically forms part of the riverbank, and there are walls on either side. So this is a perfect example of where we have third-party assets, for example, a building, which provides a very important flood risk management function to the developments and communities that sit behind it. The flood risk management function may not well be known by the owners of that building, but obviously it's obvious when you discuss it, but to general members of the public who don't work in our sector, they may not realise that some of these features play a critical part in the flood risk management system. If you take a look at the bottom right hand corner there, you can just about see on the picture some glass panels, which we just skipped over. We just about see some glass panels which form part of the flood alleviation scheme. And when you look in the far distance, there are car parks, areas of raised bank with a car park on top. There are steps. There are various lines of defence with walls that are set back, and then walls that are closer to the watercourse. And they will all have different owners, and they will all have different standards of protection and different maintenance regime for their primary function, because it's important to note that some of the assets in that picture on the right hand side, their primary function may well not be flood risk management, although obviously the glass panels form part of the recently delivered scheme. Talking about standard of protection, and this isn't particularly in relation to Leeds, because Leeds, obviously the River Air there and the flood alleviation scheme that has been ongoing for many years, they've done a lot of work in that area to understand and define the standard of protection and make sure that is well understood and that there is a designed scheme that meets the standard of protection. But if you think about the average ordinary watercourse in a smaller area of the country, in a smaller town, in any typical town really, there will be riverbanks that look just like this, with a complex mosaic of buildings, walls, car parks, sheep piled areas, steps, etc. And the standard of protection offered by those defences is in some places likely to be unknown, and those features haven't necessarily been designed to provide a specific or prescribed standard of protection. It's important to note as well that the transitions between assets are a known point of failure. So if you look particularly on the bottom right hand corner there, with all of the different structures that make up the riverbank and the walls and standard of protection above it, there are lots of different points where there could potentially be issues in the future, and should be a sort of a inspection regime around those assets, and that is typical of any urban setting when we're looking at continuous lines of defences. And the points that were raised earlier in our presentation, I really want to just kind of bring this out again. What we were dealing with in the responses, and what was a real surprise to us, were around some of the perceptions of this process. Now, I've had personal first-hand experience of designating a feature when I worked in local government, and actually the actual process was fairly straightforward, and the guidance from 2012 was really useful. And it provides, model agreements that you can use as part of that process. But there is a perception that designation is complex, and there are also perceptions around maintenance, which we found really interesting. As we said right at the beginning, the legislation doesn't place or prescribe any maintenance requirements on either the asset owner or the designating authority. And there were a lot of perceptions which we received back in the questionnaire, that maintenance would be an issue going forward in terms of budgets and in terms of placing additional responsibilities and liabilities on asset owners. So that concludes our presentation. Just before we move into the Q&A and hand back over to Philip, I'd just like to thank Becky and Flick for their contributions to this report, and also to Graham Knott, who's recently retired from ACOM and has had a long career working with CIRIA and with ACOM, and also Craig Berman from Schofield Sweeney, who provided some very valuable legal inputs for us into the research. Philip, back to you.
Thanks. Thanks to all of you for your presentation, illuminating and highlighting that there is still quite a lot of work that needs to be done to move this situation forwards. This, I think, the team recognises is a starter rather than an end point for this particular topic. We're going to move on now to the Q&A session. I'd like to invite all of the speakers to turn on their microphones and webcams so that you can take part in this Q&A session. We've received a few questions so far already through the Q&A button, and we'll come on to those. But I would like to remind all of the speakers, all of the participants, to use this function to both type in your questions as we're going along, or to highlight and give the thumbs up to certain questions that you think are very important. We will then try to focus on those as we go through that. Andy and I will sort of alternate through this Q&A session, asking the questions and maybe directing them towards particular speakers. But and we'll do that just to give us a bit of thinking time in between. Perhaps I'll start off with on one particular topic that Faye raised, which related to transitions. it's my experience through work on the International Levy Handbook, for example, or more recently on the FCRM joint programme on transitions, that transitions with flood defences are very commonly the initiator of failures and subsequent flooding. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that from a design point of view and an assessment point of view, there are a number of reports that do raise these particular issues, one being the International Levy Handbook and the other being the joint programme on transitions by FCRM, which is currently being produced. It's been worked on for a while now, but hopefully will be issued in the not too distant future. Andy, will you be able to share a link to that programme in some way?
Yeah, I think Charlotte may have to put it in the chat, but there is a landing page for the joint programme FCM transitions, which we'll endeavour to put in the chat. If not, we will follow it up with a web link for delegates. It's still in progress, actually, so there's it's more of a flag that it's coming than a link to a document itself.
Yeah, thank you. And we also, in the context of transitions, many of the case histories that were covered by the report or mentioned in this presentation deal with urban settings. You did, Faye, mention the project that you looked at in a rural setting. Perhaps just as we're getting starting with the Q&A session, if you can maybe give us a bit more context on the on that particular issue, the transitions in the rural setting.
Yeah, so obviously we spoke about the Leeds flood alleviation scheme there and the complexities in the urban environment, but that's not to say that the rural setting isn't equally as complicated. And when we're talking about the rural setting, one area that immediately springs to mind, which some of you on the call looking at the attendance list may know, is the Isle of Axholme in Lincolnshire. And that's an area it's a large area of agricultural land on the tidal trent, adjacent to the tidal trent. And there are some very large earth embankments built, post-war. And the embankments were built to provide food security and increase agricultural production. And there's a daisy chain network of pumping stations that sit behind those defences to manage water levels for agricultural purposes. And just thinking about the asset ownership in that area, the pumping station assets and low-level earth embankments, sluice gates, culverts, they are owned by, again, a mosaic of organisations from farmers, landowners, through to the Environment Agency and internal drainage boards, and how that sort of flood risk management system is interesting on a number of levels. Now, I don't know whether, I have no personal experience in recent years of the Isle of Axholme, and I don't know whether any kind of designation is being pursued, but there are obviously areas like that across our whole country. So whilst we showed some pictures with some really obvious issues when it comes to permanent, continuous lines of defences, there are other parts of our country which are in much more rural settings, and which also have some real complexities, and how those features work together to provide protection now to properties, not just to farmland, but to thousands of properties which have popped up behind those defences. It is a really important consideration, especially with the effects of climate change. Flick or Becky, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the relic defences. We mentioned it a little bit in the discussion there, but it's an interesting example of when new defences have been built and the old ones still play a really important role to a rural area. Flick?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree there, Faye. So the relic defences were they were old sort of flood defences, and they were trying to utilise those as part of the function. I think one of the difficulties with this was there was sort of conflicting legislation at this point. So I think there was a difficulty sort of under the permitting regulations to sort of remove those or change their use. So I do think that's something that's definitely a challenge and came out of this research, is the difficulties sort of with the different conflictions between legislation.
Thanks. I think given the number of questions, it might be best to move on. I note that Matt Arthur, thanks Matt, has put the link to the transitions project in the Q&A chat. That's a kind of landing page at the moment. Thanks for that, Matt. Nigel Horwell is the current winner of the most popular question. And he asks, what about the duties of the designer in assessing the ability of non-flood defence assets in resisting the loads applied? I'm making an assumption here, Nigel, that you're talking about the designer of the flood alleviation scheme, as opposed to designers who are designing buildings or other features or highways or other things. But team, I don't know where best to start. Faye, do you want to have a question?
Yeah. So I can take that one. So the legislation does not prescribe any design requirements. It's quite straightforward. So for new defences, so there's two scenarios really. The first is looking at features that already exist and are known to provide a flood risk management function, and that it could be, let's say for example, a flood wall or a wall which provides a flood risk management function, which has been around, it's been in place for 50 years. And the local authority may wish to designate it because it provides a flood risk management function for surface water. There is no requirement for the asset owner to provide any information on the standard of protection, the build type, the foundations or anything like that as part of the designation process. And equally for new builds, the legislation doesn't prescribe any design requirements, loadings, or anything like that. So it's essentially that the legislation is essentially there to designate and to make sure that those features are there for the lifetime of a development, and that they are protected. So for example, they cannot be, a wall couldn't be taken down, or if it is that it's replaced with something that's equally good at holding back water, but there is no design requirement, no standard of protection that's prescribed in legislation.
Thanks, Faye. We've got another fairly popular question posed by Blake Jones. I'll just read the question out. Can you comment on any issues relating to design life, duration of benefits, impact on economic and financial cases, and where's it gone? And design liability when including non-FRM structures into an FRM scheme. So designers in particular are looking at an FRM scheme, but having to include non-flood defence structures into it. What are the main issues relating to things like design life and cost benefit?
I can talk briefly about that on sort of in the rounds, and then either Flick or Becky probably pick up on the Morpeth scheme there, because it's a really nice example to demonstrate the case. So in terms of taking account of non-flood defence structures in a flood risk management scheme, it would be the designer's responsibility to make sure that the non-flood defence structures being incorporated into the scheme meet design requirements. So they would need to do geotechnical inspections, structural inspections, and various engineering, take the various engineering steps to make sure that for the lifetime of that asset, it is likely to withstand, to stand up to any kind of issues basically for the lifetime of the asset. And that's important from a benefits perspective. If you're putting 50 years in your partnership funding calculator, then you need to make sure that that existing asset has a 50-year design life, and if it doesn't, then you either need to look at a lower design life, or you would need to look to reinforce that asset to provide the required design life. In terms of standard of protection, there are lots of schemes around the country where existing flood walls are the basis of a flood defence scheme, and the flood wall is raised. I'm thinking about York. I know we've got Graham on the call. I'm thinking about the York flood alleviation scheme, where again, if you're raising the level of an existing defence, it's not just a matter of popping some extra bricks on top. There needs to be a full and thorough engineering assessment to make sure that the existing feature is suitable to provide that extra standard of protection and that extra raising. The Morpeth example provides a really good and nice kind of case study of what's being asked there. I can see Flick and Becky looking at each other, so I'll hand over to you if you want to just talk a little bit about the incorporation of probably the garage, isn't it, that's relevant to this garage wall?
Yeah, so they did incorporate a car garage wall into this. I think one of the things that they looked at as part of the scheme was sort of whether they could improve sort of the construction of the garage wall itself. I think at the time when they first looked to designate it, it was in poor condition. So they did look to see whether they could, sorry. Oh no, it's still going, sorry, it just froze for a second. But yeah, they did look to see whether they could sort of rebuild and improve the construction of that as part of the scheme to try and improve and facilitate that as part of the linear flood defence. Don't know if did you have anything else?
And no, just I guess that I think that the kind of overarching thing with that was it did overall reduce the capital cost of the flood alleviation scheme in general, was one of the kind of key benefits associated with that case study.
Thanks. Just one from Matt Arthur. I think may end up being a tricky one to answer in totality, but where structures are already covered by the requirements of flood risk activity permits, does designation change the legal position? Obviously, it has the benefit of raising awareness, but are there other key benefits in this situation?
It's a good question, Matthew, and I honestly don't know the answer, and my advice in that scenario would be to seek some legal advice regarding what impact the designation would have on the flood risk activity permits. I don't know, Flick or Becky, if you've got a different take on that. That's quite a legal question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and yeah, it's not something we kind of went into detail within that kind of research in the report. Obviously, we've kind of highlighted within the report that there are alternatives, such as those kind of environmental planning regulations and the kind of permitting regulations, but it wasn't, I guess, addressed it never came up in the kind of questionnaire responses or anything of the kind of conflict between designation and whether one had a benefit over the other. So yeah, I guess a point for kind of further research on that.
And another thing that did come out of the research was just sort of, there is certain legislation that would conflict with sort of the designation legislation. So for example, I think we spoke to someone who had experience designating highways, and they basically said that even if you wanted to designate a highways asset as flood storage or a flood defence, there's certain sort of caveats within the highways legislation, such as, for example, you have to prevent obstructions, and I think flooding would count as an obstruction. So as such, the two kind of conflict with each other, so you wouldn't be able to sort of designate an asset of that kind that's already covered by sort of different legislation.
Thank you. I think that kind of segues into Graham's comment there, or question, in terms of the approach of National Highways and Network Rail addressing their responsibilities. It's a complex legislative landscape with the legislation perhaps acting in some instances rather counter to each other. And I think that's why it's very difficult to generalise for individual situations, which is why we're I suppose the report itself has trodden a little bit carefully in terms of some of its recommendations. I'm conscious of time. There is a number of other questions related to designation, implying that such assets will be suitably inspected. I think that's been covered in terms of it not enforcing that. That's for discussion. And Sophia Harry Nicolau, apologies if I've mispronounced your name, about the applicability within the Thames estuary where legislation such as the Metropolitan Flood Act exists for Inner London. I don't know people's familiarity with that particular act and whether there's a comment, but I think it's yeah. Hey, Becky, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the legislation, but I'm just looking at the Q&A as well, and I guess it's in relation to the previous response as well on the different types of legislation, conflicting legislation, and which is more appropriate to use, or whether more than one piece of legislation could be used. And Craig has commented that it'd be basically to be determined on a case-by-case basis, looking at the legislation concerned and the potential conflicts. And I think the same would apply to Sophia Harry's question there. So in the Thames estuary, I guess it would be, what are you trying to achieve by looking into some form of designation, and what is the most appropriate legislation at your disposal?
Yeah, I'm going to take Graham's question and sort of feed that through. The natural flood management could result in an explosion of third-party assets forming a flood defence role, and thoughts on those. It's an interesting question, and CIRIA has actually got a project looking at asset management for blue-green infrastructure at the moment. So in terms of stepwise, there's a need for these types of features to be designated as assets in the first instance, and what that entails in terms of whole life cycle approach, and then to look at how the legal application of any designation process may or may not be applied to those. So I've got some details of those in a slide. I am conscious of time, Philip. I seem to have inadvertently taken over the chairmanship, but Charlotte, would it be possible just to flick the slides back on? Thank you. So it just remains for me to say, first of all, thank you very much to all of you who have attended. There's been a lot of participants in this. Thank you for your questions, and indeed your help in answering some of the questions. There's a lot of useful information from Craig, who was the legal advisor on the project, and Matt, who was heavily involved with the project steering group. I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you to Philip for chairing the PSG group and today's session, and also to the author team, Faye, Becky and Flick, for their input today. Thank you. I just wanted to flag some of the other CIRIA projects of interest, given the nature of the group that we've got on the call. I just mentioned the asset management of blue-green infrastructure project, which, if you're interested in, please get in touch with my colleagues, Louise or Adrian. We've also got a piece of work going on the community maintenance of flood and coastal risk management assets, which is involving organisations such as the National Flood Forum. And then, as an aside, we have a SUSDRAIN community of practice, which is focusing on the SUDS environment. Obviously, very big topic news in terms of Schedule 3 implementation, and a whole host of projects and proposals, including an update to the SUDS manual under that. So if you would like any further information, please get in touch with myself or colleagues. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution today. It's been an interesting discussion. The document itself is freely available from the CIRIA website. We will circulate the slide deck. It will be posted on this presentation will be posted on our YouTube site. But if you do have any other questions about any of the findings, please feel free to get in touch. So thank you once again to all of our contributors today, and thank you very much for your attendance and participation. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Bye now.